I'm going to work on a rhino right now. So I usually start with a smaller block. I'm not going to take this whole 25 pounds and throw it down here and try and shape that. It's just too heavy. So I like to start with a slightly smaller block. I have my paddle handy. Helps me shape this. So start with just a little bit at a time and add to it for height and length.
Okay.
Very scientific method here, you know.
Hey.
My usual go-to for how did I make this is I took a whole bunch of clay and beat it with a stick till it looked like a rhino.
There you go.
It's really the best description. Don't you guys think?
Yes.
That's about what I do in here.
Looks good.
So I'm making this a body right now. And at this point, I'll kind of start to decide what end is the back end and what end's the front. I've kind of already got this paddle to look like a back end, so I'll just leave that. The thing to consider with this method is that when the clay is soft like this, it's going to sink down a little. And I have to make sure that it keeps its height. And so if I need to, I'll lay it down and paddle that to get that height back. So if it ever starts to sink on me, if it ever starts to get shorter than I want it to be, that's how I fix that. So if I've decided this is the back end, then these are going to be shoulders. And I'm going to build a neck and head right off of this.
Oh, cool. I love it. He's already got ears and everything.
So at this point I start to think what makes a rhino and not a horse. One, they have very high shoulders and their head is lower than their shoulders. So if these are his shoulders, that's the first thing I'm going to alter. They're also a lot wider, so I can start to put in some mass for a belly. And I'll also want to build out his back end a lot. They're a little shorter than horses, so unlike this horse over here, he's got kind of less height in the block. If I ever found that I needed to add more height though, it would be as easy as cutting a little bit off of this block here. I'll make it about the same shape and size as what I have. If I need him to be taller, I can make him taller rather quickly.
Wow. Cool.
One thing I do think is I might need a little more length. Animals have a lot more length in their bodies than you think. And I'm going to make sure I have plenty of room to have legs inside this block and also enough length in the belly. So if I can kind of look at this and see that I can put legs up here and legs back here and still have plenty of room for belly in the middle, then that'll help me kind of judge that. I can also just look at my images. I can measure the size of the animal's head just with my fingers and decide, like, it's about 1, 2, maybe 1, 2, 3.5 heads long. So 1, 2, 3, about 3.5 heads long. And that sort of measuring can help a lot if you're not sure if your block is big enough. Once I kind of have some mass on there, I want to start thinking about gesture. Kind of want this rhino to be walking or striding, and when that happens, that means that I need to make allowances for, like, these legs. You can see that I've got one going forward, one going way back, one kind of lifted in the front, one kind of straight. So I'll look at those And if I look at the outline of this animal, and I think about my block of clay actually needs to end after this stretched out foot. And what I can do is just build out for that stretched foot, like this.
Oh.
She did that on the first one.
So
Really cool.
It was so easy.
I know.
Good golly, Miss Molly.
And rhinos have pretty wide heads, so I'm going to add a little bit to his head and to the bottom of his neck.
Big head.
Big heads and necks, they're just big bulky guys. Sometimes if I'm not sure if I've got the head right, or if I think I might need more height in places, just add it like that. If I'm not sure if the head's correct, I'll put almost like a placeholder for the horns or any prominent feature on the animal that will help me see it. So these horns will kind of help me see, is the face long enough? Is it big enough? Is it wide enough? Because at this point when the clay is really soft, you want to think about what you need to add. You're not thinking about detail. You're not thinking about anything except mass and gesture and proportion. And that's the beauty of this solid building method, is that you don't have any structure or building or process that is keeping you from concentrating on gesture and expression and the form and the mass and the proportion. You can just add where you need to and take away where you need to without having to think too much about it.
This is prehistoric, right?
Yes, this is a prehistoric rhino that I'm doing. So I'm looking at the modern day rhino for some anatomy that is familiar to me, and then I'm applying it and altering it for this prehistoric rhino. So this prehistoric rhino's eyes were much lower on its head than the modern day rhino. Its nose was much more blunt and less pointed. And it had this Y-shaped horn that stuck right off the end there. And they had pretty long faces, and they also had a really distinct skull that's almost a more exaggerated version of the modern day rhino that swoops down from a high point. So I'll make the back of the skull here and create that swooping to the horns. And I can already kind of just put little ridges here for where the eyes will go. And you can see that rhino face already. So I'm going to look at this walking image, and it looks like the foot that's stretched back is on the same side as the straight foot. So this side is going to have a straight foot. I'm just going to build out for that leg and shoulder. These rhinos also had really bulky shoulders. If you look at a lot of animals, they're narrow in the area here is where they narrow in, but their wide parts are in the shoulders and the hips. And so that's usually where I add first, is for shoulders and hips. This is still pretty wet. I'm trying not to push too hard down on the top of it. I don't want it to sink. Still trying to think about the gesture. These guys really had almost excessive shoulder humps. You can see in their spine how much more their spine goes up above their head. So this hump is going to be really important to this anatomy, and the slope down to the spine is going to be something that I'm looking at, is this area right in here. So skeletons help a lot. They help you see why things look the way they do. Especially on animals, their skulls give you a lot of input on the depressions and the shapes of things. So if you see that a rhino has a lot of low and high ridges in its face, if you look at the skull, a lot of times that shows you why. All those ridges are related back to the bones. I feel like bones are a really good place to start. And they can help you see things that might be covered up by the animal when it has hair and fur and skin on it. And too, like elephants, for instance, you can't see the shape of their neck because their ear blocks it. But if you have the skeleton or a muscle drawing, you can see that without something covering it up. So a lot of times that anatomy is something that is really helpful. And I'm just smushing this clay on here. You'll notice I'm not too worried about air pockets right now, which are a concern for a lot of you who've thrown on the wheel and know about clay. You don't want a lot of air pockets, but I don't have to worry about that because I know when I hollow this animal out, I'm going to get rid of any air pockets, any funny places in between the clay, anywhere there wasn't enough compression is going to come out when I hollow.
Have you grab one more time, but I won't have you talk or anything. So kind of just sit there and I'll tell you when you're going to grab it. Go ahead and put your hand away, yeah. Actually, you want to take that piece out, because I'll have you just grab a new one. And go. Thank you.
That's a fun shot. I like that.
Wow.
I'm still building out some mass here. Let's go back and think about those legs a little bit. So, looking at this one, I've got a leg that's much more forward than this extended one that I added for. And I've got a leg that's lifted on this side. Sometimes the best way to find that is to draw it on there. So,
There it is.
Oh.
so there's a lifted leg inside that block. I just have to find it. And drawing always helps me. If you're not very good at drawing, well, I don't know. This is how I do it. I don't know, and I don't
Take a
know
lesson.
another way. If you're not very good at drawing, you don't have to be good at it to do this. You can just look at the image and give yourself a guideline. Kind of like sculpt by numbers, I guess. So this leg's going to be more forward.
Mm.
Drawing always helps me find this animal that is inside this block somewhere.
That's cool.
Helps me see, as soon as I draw this on here, I can see, do I have enough mass in that area? Do the legs look short? Does any of the anatomy look out of place? Does the belly look longer on one side than the other? Is it because he has a leg back, or is it because there's too much length? This sort of comparison that you have to do when you sculpt and turning things around and trying to see it from every angle, the drawing can really help you see where things don't look right, or where, like this leg, if you look at it from the back, so look at it head on and see how it angles in funny.
Yeah.
It's not built out enough.
Oh, okay.
So that just by drawing that on there where that leg needs to be, you can see where to build that out.
Then you'll
Interesting.
hollow him out, and then you'll start carving
Yes.
to make the legs look like the photo.
Right. So I won't do actually any of the leg or feet detail until I've taken the block completely away from the legs. They'll just be posts. They won't have any shape even. They'll just be cylinders for the most part. And I shape all of them after it's hollow back together and he's standing on his legs, and I can access all sides of them. Because right now it's in the block. So I don't want to do toes. I don't want to sculpt the ankle shape. I'm not going to worry about any of that until I can access it easily from all sides. Okay? So,
Looking good.
as much as I'm liking the walking, I think his head could be a little more interesting, and I always think about how animals move and observe their movements, and when an animal moves, its head usually moves with it, especially if it's really heavy, like this rhino is. He's going to move forward, and whatever leg is going forward, his head's going to kind of swing the opposite direction with that movement. So their momentum kind of follows that. So I can easily, with this clay super wet, I can make this rhino look up. I can make him look around. I can make him follow the movement of his walk. by just angling his head to the side. And I'll just push
Like
that.
that. Mhm.
And the great thing about this solid building method and the clay being so wet and malleable right now and not have to think about structure is that you can just do that and you can immediately see it and not be wondering if it's going to look right later when you're done putting it together.
Now, would you do this with Rod Bod also?
Yeah. Mhm. This is Soldate, but Rosbod and Soldate are so similar. Rosbod is the type of clay. Rosbod and Soldate 60 are both types of clay that I would use for sculpture because they have a lot of sand in them. They shrink less than most clays. That sandy grog, we call it, that's in there, makes it shrink a lot less than other clays, and therefore prevents cracking and all of that.
What is this clay body?
This is Soldate 60.
Hmm.
It's just what I have on hand right now. I'm usually not too picky about my clay.
Well, when you can do it like that, you don't need to be.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, when you have worked with clay long enough to know when it's leather hard and when it's not, and you get that timing down and you can feel it and know those things, you can pretty much work with any clay because clays all have the same rules
Yes.
for the most part. This clay is more forgiving than most clay, which is nice. So if this clay dries out too much and I really have to spray it and bring it back, you're going to get a lot less cracks, if any, from this clay than from a porcelain or stoneware or a clay that's not made for sculpture.
Ah.
So therefore, a clay that shrinks less and cracks less when it's rehydrated is best for my process because of how dry I let these get. You just want to feel this one. So once I've done this, I've created gesture, I've created movement while the clay is soft. I've drawn on there to find the animal itself and put on the mask that I need everywhere. Another thing about rhinos is that their ankles and hind legs angle back. They have a kind of an angled shape to them. So I'll paddle a little bit of that in right now. When I get to sculpting the front feet too, I'll remember that rhinos, because of all their weight, their ankles turn out when they put their weight on them. And so this foot that's on the ground completely is going to be kind of turned out just a little bit on the wrist. And so that makes it look more like it's carrying weight. But you see how if I angle this hip and this ankle back, it has more of a rhino-like stance.
It's amazing.
They kind of stand with their ankles pointing to each other. They're kind of bow-legged. It's funny that way.
And you just get that from the skeleton?
From the skeleton or just from watching them. So I go to the zoo a lot and study them a lot, watch them walk around, and you can see just how they carry themselves. Pachyderms are really, rhinos and elephants and hippos, all those pachyderms, they're really heavy and they carry themselves very differently than other animals. They can still move very quickly, but how they carry and throw their weight is totally different than a more live animal. That's something I love about them. These rhinos are just big tanks. I think that that's really cool. So that's about where I'll get this to let it sit out, and it'll be this leather hard when I'm ready to keep working on it. And so I'll literally take this now and set it aside and not work on that for a while. I'll leave him out for maybe 2 days.
So you're going to watch his little head so that as it droops, you're going to push it back up
Yeah.
as he dries?
I don't really need these here, but I'll
Yeah.
leave them there for now. And those might come off later while I'm working. But for now, for roughing out the body and getting the gesture right, that's all I need to do.
And
I'll let
you
it
won't
stiffen.
cover it?
No, I won't cover it at all. I might, after the first day, cover the head. I might, if I'm not going to be here for a few days, drape it. But I really want that block to get this dry. And this took 2 whole days and nights
Wow.
of just sitting out uncovered. I had the head covered,
Oh,
but
yeah,
even
I
still,
thought-
it got a little stiff, which is nice. So this is so rigid now, so if I were to push on this or keep working on it, he would just sink. So
Oh.
Once I get it the perfect height and size and all the proportions right, I leave it alone, because if I were to keep working on it, it would just keep sinking and I'd have more and more to do. But this one now, I can take away a lot of this block, and the clay will be strong enough to hold itself up. If you start taking away this block, you're going to lose his structural integrity. He's just going to sink on that leg and fall over.
Okay, so did I take too much?
You need to stop.
Okay, well, should I put some back?
No, you'll be fine. As long as you haven't noticed any major sinking, you don't need to put any back. But I would definitely leave that out for a good, 24 hours. And just let it get this stiff. Because at this point, I've got so much stiffness that I can start carving, which is where I start doing more of my anatomy figuring out. I like carving clay that's like this because it just comes away. I can get really precise with it. And I use it to define anatomy. And you don't happen to have your horse anatomy book, do you?
Mhm.
I have an anatomy book, especially for horses. And I will just start by looking at profile shot of this horse's musculature and skeleton. And I can carve in here. Start carving a bicep, foreleg. I can take now those lines that I carved on here, and now with the block much stiffer, I can go up against my line and start taking away some of that block. See how I'm taking this away? But feel it. It's leather hard,
Oh,
but
yeah,
it's
but
flexible.
it's still, yeah.
It's
Wow.
wet leather hard, which is perfect. And this is exactly what I want. It's strong enough that I can bang on it, I can push on it, I can really work on it without worrying about the head falling off or the leg collapsing. It's strong enough now to hold its shape.
I'm going to the bookstore. Does anybody need anything? Soda?
If you find any
Okay.
money, just bring it
I'll
back.
bring it. Yeah, I will. I'll get them samples.
Okay. That's a killer.
So I
Come
can
on,
go
Bruce.
really deep up against these legs now.
This is your next project after this.
She's already done some of this. Her elephant's getting pretty stiff. You can see how I'm taking a little bit more out now, safely. So I can safely reveal a lot of this anatomy. Can take a lot away from the belly, can take away a lot away from beside the legs, but I don't want to take away too much of this block, especially when the legs are really thin. I don't want to do maybe more than that. I still want to keep this leg connected to the block. I don't want to cut through. So if I separate it, it'll start to dry. Solid clay takes so much longer to dry out than small pieces of clay and hollow pieces of clay that if you keep these legs connected as long as possible, they'll stay the same as this big thick body. And you'll get less cracking and less breaking and all those problems that come from trying to make an animal on legs this skinny. But I can still use the rigidity of this clay to start carving some of that anatomy into the leg and some of that musculature. Now this clay is still wet enough that if I just spray it, I can still add to it wherever I need to.
Okay.
So that's that perfect leather hard state. So this is not necessarily all the mass I'll need, and it's not necessarily perfect. Did it really fast. I may need to still add to it at this point, in which case that's why it's nice to have it wet leather hard. You can still add to it.
Why didn't we do a giraffe like that?
Well, because somebody wants to pay me for a horse.
Oh.
So I can do a giraffe like this, though. Christine wants to do a giraffe like this, and so I can show that. But probably what I would do for a giraffe is a little bit different. You can use the solid block method for this, but a giraffe's legs are so much longer and skinnier that it might be easier to actually combine the armature and the solid block technique for a giraffe. So what you would do is you'd have your giraffe.
Yeah, those are amazing animals.
Again, familiarity with the animal itself. So you'd have your giraffe, But what you probably want to do is put an armature up in here to help hold up the chest, and then you could leave some of this as solid clay. So you'd still be doing the block method, but you'd have an armature as added support for this long neck and head. And another cool thing you can do with armatures is if you have a little elbow joint, you start working really big, you can use 2 poles and a little joint in between them, go all the way up into the head. So if I made a 24-inch giraffe, that's how I'd do it. And I would leave this solid clay in here as long as I could to keep the legs from drying out. But because they're so tall, they're not a great candidate for this method without an armature, because all of this height starts to require an armature. Now, if you do a giraffe that's maybe only this tall, you could do that with a solid block. The legs are going to be very, very skinny. And what you might have to do, and what I might have to do with this horse, is end up cutting the legs off right here when I hollow the body. And I'll work on the legs in my hand, and I'll keep them wrapped in saran wrap. And I'll be very, very careful about not letting those skinny legs dry out while I'm hollowing this and finishing this. Then they'll go back on once the body is hollow. I'll put the legs back on upside down, flip the whole thing over, and then they'll be ready to support it. A lot of times, too, with the skinny animals, you need to keep some of this block, about this much, as a firing support to hold up the body for the legs in the kiln. Because if those legs dry first, they're going to snap under the weight of that body. But if you have them to where they're just touching the ground, but they're not holding up the body, the block is holding up the body, you can use this as a firing support to take the weight. And that's a lot of times a good solution for really skinny legs. Rhinos don't need it so much, but horses, giraffes, anything with skinny legs is going to need some support.
Okay, but the block is not attached when you fire it.
No.
It's
I still
just-
cut it away, and I even hollow out the block, and I poke some holes in it. But I keep this section that fit perfectly up against his belly.
Okay.
And then I just have to shape it and make sure it's the right height still. And then I just, when I put those legs on and flip it over, I flip it over onto that support. And then I keep the legs all wrapped while I finish the detail on the head and any of that.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm just going to do a little more shaping here so you guys can see how I'll start to refine this with the loop tool. I can also refine this with my wood tool, combed tool. You can dig this kind of curved tool in at your line and bring it up. And you'll start to free that and separate that belly really deep. And I'm keeping it curved. So the curve of this tool is keeping that round belly for me. So defining, refining, all of that can happen now that this clay is stiffer. And like I said, this could take me a few hours if I was really going to get it to the point of being ready to hollow. I'll also use it at this point too. So I've got some of the anatomy drawn on there, like the chest. And remember, the chest is really in between those shoulders. You want to make sure this is always wide enough that you still have room for a chest in the middle of it. Just like us, if we were to do this, we've got chest muscles in between our arms. So it makes this extra wide in the front. So if you just make animals' shoulders right next to each other, it looks like there's a lot of width missing. I usually prefer a smaller loop tool for this, but mine snapped. So
Would you like to use mine? I have it over
you
here.
have one that's like the square end of this size.
Yeah. Well, it's smaller
Got those itty bitty ones. The pec muscles now, and the lines I drew for them as a guideline to do the neck muscles. And like I said, this is where I'll do a lot of my musculature is carving at this stage. So you can see now the chest muscles and the neck muscles are a little more defined. And I've just followed the lines that I drew on there and created depressions for the areas in between those muscles. And it just makes them stand out a little bit more. Which horses have really muscular necks. It's easy to see all those layers of muscle in that drawing in that book. I can find them from that. Animals are also very narrow from the top, and you can see in this top side illustration just how narrow they are. Their neck is almost, you can't even see the width of it. It's so narrow. Giraffe necks are the same way. They're just a line compared to their body. And you see all the width is coming out of their shoulders and their hips. That's what I'm. So a lot of times it's really good to look at your animal from up here and really see if you're getting that direction as well. As much as you have to spin these and look at them from all sides, you also want to look at them from the top. You may want to, for the undersides of the jaw or the face, get down on this level and see what they look like from below. And just looking at things from more directions is always more helpful in sculpture. You really need every angle, every view. And that's what makes it harder than a lot of different art forms, because painters only have to think about one side of things. And in here, we do everything kind of three-dimensionally. It's a totally different way of thinking. I'm going to add a little bump here for his tail bone and see if I've got enough muscle in his back end. Because if I want to see the length of the spine, I need everything from the front of the face, the eyes, down the back of the neck, down the whole spine, down to that tailbone. So wherever that tailbone ends can tell me, does this look full enough? And so finding that is a huge help, with horses especially. They have very long spines. Very long spines and a lot of distance in the belly. You can also start to shape the face a little bit now. Put some bumps up at the top. These are a lot of times what I call ear nubs. They're just little points, like the hip bones. They give me a place where the ears are going to come out of, and that helps me see, do I have the eyes at the right spot compared with where the ears are. All of this drawing and putting little bumps on and finding different parts of the anatomy, because everything's connected, it helps me see, do I have enough space? What's the relationship between these things? And especially with faces, just like with our faces, you can measure between our eyes is an eye's width. So if you have an eye here, there's an eye's width between them. You can do the same thing with animals. You just have to kind of look at the photos a little bit more, and at whatever you have as a guide, these proportions can help me kind of figure out the eyes are actually pretty close to the ears. So I might make those bumps in the skull for the eye bones a little higher. So just like everything on our bodies is relatable to something else and connected, animals are the same way. You might be a little confused by this leg here and how that's bending. And the difference between us and a horse leg, our leg and a horse leg, is that their ankle is actually up here. And so the structure of their leg is the same as ours. It's just altered a little bit. So think about it more like a human being on their tiptoe. So if I bend my knee like this, and if my body were to cross my knee, like a horse's does, horses' knees hit their belly, their ankle is that high bone point that sticks up, and then this whole length here is actually more like a foot bone, and it's like they're on their tiptoes. So you can take something simple that we understand, like our leg, and just bend it at an angle and see the horse leg shape. So if you keep in mind that their knees and elbows are what cross their body, it's a little easier to understand the bends in their legs. I like to keep my horse feet kind of big. They have big hooves compared to their skinny legs. I might need to add a little bit still to these, just to widen them up. But this clay is stiff enough now that I can really start defining a lot of that anatomy. And I can start taking away more of the block in order to reveal more of the legs. And you see how this clay is just like peeling off in ribbons? If I do this on this, it's all
It's
gunky.
gobby.
So it's too wet for this technique. So that's why I like to leave this out for a couple of days and have it just shave off. And it only takes away a little. So on soft clay, this gouges away a lot. If I want to do something really tight and controlled and only take away a tiny bit, this stage of clay works much better for precision. Which you guys already know by now I'm all about. Type A personality in me. Like looking at all this stuff and getting it just right. That's kind of what I would start doing once I had this stage dried out. I'd start carving, start finding the anatomy, I'd start refining the form and trimming the block down. And eventually I'll get it trimmed down enough that I can slice this whole thing in half and hollow it out. And at that point I'll have it trimmed down so much that there'll be very little block between the legs. And once I cut that free, I'll be able to trim the insides of the legs and shape those and make them look how I want. But right now I'm just going to leave them connect to that block for their safety so they don't dry.
And again, would you cut the head off?
I would.
You in half, but then in
Yeah.
thirds, really.
Yeah, so I can show you where I'd cut this. I would cut the head right here. So I'd cut the head right behind the jawline. I'd cut the neck off. The neck would be a section. And I'd cut the whole body in half. Just like that.
And hollow to how thick?
About 1/4 of an inch. I get my pieces really thin because if you think about a wheel, a pot that you throw on the wheel, a really thick pot isn't really as strong as a really thin pot that's been compressed multiple times to that thin, all the way
On
around.
these, you've added clay too, so
Mhm.
you try to do 1/4 of an inch all the way.
Exactly, because
Do
when
the
it's
hollows.
done, I haven't done any of my detail or texture yet. And I'll do that once it's hollow and back together. And sometimes that requires me to add some clay just for that detail and texture, or fur, or something like that. And if I had this at like 1/2 inch or an inch thick, it would make it almost 2 inches thick when I added that clay at the end. So it's better to get things thinner and try and keep everything as even as possible.
So
That
you
really
can
will make a
still
stronger
add
piece.
after you hollow.
Yes, absolutely, and I'll show you guys that now. So I've got a rhino that I've hollowed and put back together. They gave me this bumpy, leathery hide texture, and this is a putty mold material that you can press onto anything and take a print of it. These are made of silicone, and I poured these onto textures that I liked, and now I can press them into clay and get a really interesting, awesome texture really quickly. These are also flexible, so I can shape them to things like this. I also have some that are plaster. I have some that are bisque clay stamps. I have a lot of different silicone molds. These are just really handy to have around. And then the main thing that I use for these rhinos are these pitted rocks. These are my favorite tool for this because they make these raised bumps, which the hardest thing to do when you're making a texture is make raised texture, because you have to add. So if I had to add every single one of these, roll a little ball and add it, it would just take forever. Whereas this, I can find an area that I want to add texture to. So this guy's so leather hard now that I'm spraying, or I'm going to slip and score that area a little bit. But usually if I score it and spray it, it gets wet enough to accept more clay. I'll put like a skin almost of wet clay there. So this is what I mean by sometimes I add to these hollow ones for texture. It's very little that I'm adding, but sometimes on furry animals I add a lot more to create fur. So I'm just going to add a little bit to this area, and on these rhinos their armor is kind of more bumpy on the edges. So I'll take one of my rocks and we'll make some of these raised bumps just by rolling it on there. I'll kind of rough things up a little bit.
Where did you find rocks like that? Was it just
I've had
lava?
people give them to me. I found one like walking down in the woods. You know, go outside a lot and find things. Another thing I'll use sometimes are these oyster shells, the barnacles on them. Make really great bumpy texture. And then I'll blend it in with some of the smaller pits on these. So I like these silicone ones because these little tiny bubbles that they have are a little more subtle, and I can kind of blend, I can bend these to press them into that wet clay and get something a little finer transitioning into those big bumps.
Christine, sometimes coral, there are kinds of coral that have...
Yeah. Yep. So you never know. And this too, like this rock has really fine pits. And this is a pumice, like volcanic stone that I found down in the woods by my parents' house. And that makes an even finer bump texture. And so, you know, I've got beach rocks in here. I've got, this is a Bisqueware stamp, so I pressed this on one of these rocks, a little piece of clay, and I pulled a handle up out of it, and then I fired it. So you can make stamps out of bisque. I make plaster ones. Some of these are ones that I pressed onto actual chicken feet to get this kind of scaly texture that these have. So lots of different things you can do with just found object textures. This is a cap for a bone, like a kneecap or something. But the inside of it is a really interesting texture. And so I have all kinds of like found natural objects that I just keep because I'm like, oh, that would look really good pressed into clay. Like, and that always helps me when I have to look at an animal and go, now how can I make that texture without it taking me all day? Because for me, trying to make a living this way, you have to kind of find faster ways to do things. Especially when you told someone that this rhino was going to be $200. And you need to make it so that you actually make that money in an amount of time. It doesn't take you longer.
What's a block of clay called?
Well, they usually come in 50 pounds. So a block of clay, like what I started with here, is 25 pounds. So you get 2 bags in a box, 50 pounds. And a box is usually $20 to $25. But if you order in bulk, you can get cheaper. And Trinity Ceramics Supply in Dallas is where most people here get their clay. And they have like a student sale every fall where you can get it really cheap. Like half off boxes.
How long will it last in its state? Infinity or?
No, we wish. If you keep it for, you know, a year in the bags in the box, it might dry out just from air making its way through that plastic over time. But the great thing about clay is that even when it dries out and it seems useless, you can just wet it back down and it turns back into wet clay, and you just bring it back. So, like these animals, I hollow out a good amount of clay. You know, I started with this much, but I'll get probably that, you know, half that back or more. And I'll have a bunch of scraps, and I'll take that and I'll put it in a bucket and I'll fill it with water and just slake it down to sludge. And then I'll put that out on something absorbent, plaster or canvas, until it soaks the water out of it, and then I'll just roll it back up and I'll have wet clay again.
No waste.
No waste. Never any waste with clay.
clay like a natural, or is they additives they put with it just to make it get to the consistency that people like?
Sometimes. So some throwing clays have what they call plasticizers added to them so that when you have that much water on the clay, it's still flexible and it'll stretch farther. So there's some chemicals that are added to it for different things. Sculpture clays have grog added to them, which is very fine powdered fired clay. And it's what's making these little sandy, grainy things in the clay when I'm sculpting with it. And those are actually what helps it shrink less in the kiln and move less, prevents cracks. And it basically just makes it so that when I wet this back down all the time after it's dry, it won't crack from going back and forth to dry and wet. It just moves less and it makes the clay a little nicer. So like porcelain and what you see that's really white, that will have no grog in it. And it'll shrink about 15% in the kiln from this state to fired. And this will shrink maybe 8. So that difference in shrinkage and that amount of movement in the kiln is what makes some clays harder to work with than others for different methods. So throwing...
You don't wrap it each, I know you wrap it each night, but do you put any kind of spray on it, or you just...
I spray it with water. So like I've been kind of spraying this every once in a while, the clay will just soak that in. So I can spray this, it's fairly dry. I can spray the top of it and you can see the water on it right now, but here in about a second it just soaks it right in. So if I spray this too much, he'll get soft again and he'll start to like fall. So I just spray it a little bit where I'm working, and I spray it, or I spray the plastic, I wrap it in to keep it wet for a longer period of time. So that's how I kept him perpetually at this state. That's really how that works. Just want to see a rhino ear? Anybody? Okay. So I've got these little bulges here on his head, and those are those ear nubs I was talking about, these little points. I make those as placeholders because you can't do ears and things like that until the very, very end because they'll dry so fast. Anything very small is going to dry really quickly, so I do all those tiny details when I'm about to be totally finished with a piece. So I'll actually make a hole there in that nub because rhino ears look like kind of like a trumpet coming out of a fold of skin. So they have this great trumpet shape, but they've got this ridge of skin around it. So that's why I make a hole for the rhino ears. And I'll stick them down in there so it looks like they're coming out of that skin fold. I'll take a little lump of clay like this. Hopefully this is the right size for him. They have kind of big ears. I'll pinch it out to like an ear shape. And like I said, their ears are like trumpets, so I'll make this really thin. And then I'll kind of push right here in the middle and roll this around so it starts to look right. Sometimes I will wet my fingers a little bit, and the clay will pull with a little bit of water to be even thinner and have more of that shape. I'm kind of careful with it, but then you can get that really thin edge, kind of torn look that they have. And two, the ear has a lot of integrity because it's thick, so I made the edge look paper thin, and that's usually how I get that effect. I guess this is a left ear. Sometimes I don't know which one I'm starting with until I fold it. But I'll pull off a little bit of the excess and I'll point this so that it really fits down in here. And then what I'll have to do usually is put a little bit of slip in there. So whenever you're attaching anything really that you want to stay to any of these pieces that have been leather hard, you really want to use a little bit of slip.
Slip is what?
Slip is clay that's had so much water added to it that it's basically like yogurt or goop. And we use that to attach things, kind of like glue. So when I
Has the adhesive property to it?
no, it's just, it's so wet that it sticks the two drier pieces of clay together. And a lot of times what we'll do too, for things to stick better, because this clay is dry, and if I just take a wet piece of clay and stick it to it, it's going to come right off super easy. So I have to now, at this point that it's dried, I have to do what we call scoring and slipping to attach anything to it. So I'm going to take a needle and rough it up, and I'm going to put a little bit of slip in there. And then I'm going to stick the ear in.
It looks like a different kind of slip, different kind of clay. Does that matter?
They're the same clay, they're just different batches. So these are both sold $8.60, but this was mixed, I think, later at a different time, so it's a slightly different color. But it doesn't matter. I use just whatever slip I have laying around usually. So yeah, now he's got an ear in there. And I can kind of play with the attitude of it.
How was this big fire piece like that?
The first time?
The first time, was the second, or?
Yeah, so the first time's that bisque firing I was talking about, and then we glaze it and then we put it back in. And so once it's bisque fired, it can go through that firing process much faster than the first time. So because of how much the clay moves and how it changes states, this clay has silica in it, glass basically, and that's what turns it hard in the kiln when it reaches a certain temperature. And so it's going through a chemical reaction in that kiln, and it goes through a period of time between about probably 450 and 1200 in that range where it's changing states. And if you take it too fast through that change, it moves a lot and it'll crack. If you take it pretty slow, like I'm saying, like around 100 degrees an hour, not much faster, you get less things cracking. These sculptures take a little longer to fire because I have places that are thicker and thinner, places that might not be dry. And because of that water I was talking about exploding out of things when it hits the boiling point, I'll hold this for about 12 hours at 180, so just under boiling. And I'll have it, the water will just be steaming out of that clay. And when I feel it and I think it's totally dry and has no more water in it, then I'll let the kiln go up. So sometimes that makes the first firing take an extra 12 hours just for that period of time, that preheat, which we call candling, where you have the kiln at a very low temperature to get the water out of the clay. And then you let it go up slowly to that 1200, and then the temperature we bisque fire to is 1940. And so once it's gone to that temperature, the clay is still porous, and we can paint it with glaze and it'll be absorbent. Sometimes I use actual house paint and what I call cold finishes on my pieces as well. And so it's porous enough at that temperature to still accept things on the surface. But once it would go to like 2300 degrees, it would no longer be porous. You wouldn't be able to paint it with anything. It would just not soak anything in. So yeah, that's kind of the difference in those temperatures and why we have to fire sculpture a little bit slower. Because it might have an area that's thick. Like these legs are solid. So they're going to dry slower than this body that I hollowed to that 1/4 inch. These neck folds are like solid coils that I put on there. So if I take this too fast, either the legs might blow off because they're not dry yet, or the coils and things that I've added might pop off the top. If I dry things really slowly and carefully and make it maybe a 3 or 4 day firing for that first firing, all of this will be intact. Yeah, we try and eliminate that by learning from what happens to us.
And it's not fun to have a piece blow up.
It's really
And I
not.
speak from experience,
Yeah, Christine's had some pieces blow.
because it was fired too fast.
Yeah.
And you feel responsible because when your piece blows, it blows somebody else's piece.
A lot of the time
Yeah.
can destroy someone else's piece. Another thing I should have done with these ears is make both of my little ear balls at the same time. Because now I'm trying to make this one the same size, and I'm like, oh, I don't know if this is going to be the same size. So eyes and ears, sometimes it's really good to do both of those balls of clay at the same time, so you have the same amount on both sides. No mismatched business going on. So I'm pretty good at fudging it at this point. Isn't it Brandon? I think he looks like he thinks he's hot stuff. He's got some attitude to him. It's that tank. attitude. I'm not afraid much. So once I have these ears in and I have them at kind of the attitude that I want, I will add a little more clay around that seam. I'll make like a coil, a little tiny one, so something like this. I'll put it up against the edge of the ear. I'm mixing up my clays now. And I'll use one of my smaller tools. This is one of my favorite tools. It's a little bitty. It's got a nice wooden end that's small, and then it's got this tiny little loop tool, wire loop tool at the other end. This is actually for making doll faces. So it gives me a lot of precision and detail when I'm doing this sort of thing. And I'll want to make this kind of wrinkle of skin by the ear look like the ear is going inside of it. I'm going to use this tool for that. Start to make this look all like it's attached. And I'll let these kind of sit here for a bit and let the slip dry on them so they're not so messy. When you first slip and score something together, the slip kind of squeezes out and it can make things a little sticky. But that's good. That means that these are really well attached. They're not just going to pull right out of his head. This is usually, this part, doing the texture and the detail, is what takes me the longest. I mean, I'd say it took me a couple hours just to do the toes and the legs. So this is the point that I start spending a lot of time on things. So this is really fast. It starts to slow things down. The hollowing is a lot longer in comparison. You know, I can do this in under an hour, but the hollowing is going to take me at least half a day. So that's kind of the ratio. And when I work really large, I can build the large piece solid in a day, but it'll take me 2 weeks to hollow it and put it back together. And that's kind of the difference there with this technique, is that it seems like, oh, you're working really fast and it's going to be great, and then you have to hollow. And that's where you have to be really careful about everything and compress the walls really tight, because all of that is the structure of your piece. There's no internal structure going on in here holding them up. It's just how tight and nice I get those walls. And so that hollowing part takes a lot longer because of that. There's some little rhino ears. A little bit of detail on him. I'll leave him out for a little bit.
So you're going to texture the other butt?
The other butt? What are you talking about?
The bottom butt?
Which one? Oh, the bottom part? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to do that, but I'm probably not going to do it right now. I'll do it later today.
Once you do the butt, then he's finished, and you just let him dry?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, I'll probably do some more work on his face. He needs some more wrinkles across his nose, and they've got a lot of skin folds and wrinkles around their eyes. And I'll do, with this little loop tool, I'll kind of carve those in, like the little folds of skin around his eyes that I already have here. There'll just be a little more of that on the face. And a lot of these textures, I take a brush over them with water afterwards, and it just smooths out the texture and makes it all uniform. Like on the legs, these started out as just scratches in the clay for those wrinkles, and then I went over them with a brush and water and achieved that smooth, wrinkled skin look. So these textures take a little longer to do because I start by doing them all over and then refining and picking and carving and doing all that. I also have my jacket and shape them. And I got both of them to where they were the same shape, facing the opposite ways. And then, one at a time, started with a bamboo skewer down into the head in that ear bump. And I laid this slab up against that bamboo skewer. And I used these extra ones for support. And what they've been doing is holding the ears up while these slabs get leather hard. And they're going to get leather hard fairly fast because they're thin slabs. But I can help them along by, while they stiffen, kind of carving and shaping these ears. Now, a lot of times things like this, people would say that's impossible, you can't do that in clay, it's not going to hold itself up. But if you have something to hold it until it stiffens and dries, it will hold itself up when it's leather hard. So I'll be able to put her in the kiln all leather hard, and her ears will just support themselves.
And she's not hollow yet.
She is hollow.
She is hollow.
Yes, I would never do the ears if she wasn't. So if I'm doing ears, that piece is hollow. These are so thin that if I had to cut her head off and hollow it, I wouldn't want to have to cut the ears off and do any of that either. So I usually just leave them out until she's hollowing back together. And she was hollowed, let's see, in the head, neck, the body, and the body down here. So she was in about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces. And then the legs are mostly solid. The hind feet are solid. And I got into the hips and hollowed those out. But those parts are all solid.
And when you said hollowing, and then you also said compressing, so you're also compressing besides just pulling clay out. You're
Yes.
pushing it against the outside wall.
And I'll show you that when you hollow your elephant. And Anne's been doing some of it. If you have one of your pieces, you can show her. So once you dig all that clay out, I take a butter knife and I scrape it up against the walls of that piece. And it's like an elongated rib tool. And it just takes that wall and compresses it and makes it really tight.
So that it's smooth.
Exactly.
inside.
So you know how clay is made up of all these particles, and at first they're all laying around haphazardly all over the place. When you compress something, you make them lay like this, strong like scales, just over one another, and everything gets really tight. And you can squeeze that hollow form once you've compressed it, and it won't change shape. It just makes everything really strong. So once I do all that hollowing and reattaching, which takes a long time, I kind of retextured the surface of this. She was pretty rough from when I did the original solid work. She looked a lot like these guys. And now I've kind of added a little bit more texture to her, kind of a rough sculpted texture. It's really loose. Like to leave in kind of the hand of the artist. If I make this too perfect and try and make it look exactly like a rabbit, there's no evidence that anybody made it, and I like to leave in some of this smushing that happens when I make these. And sometimes I end up putting it back in from the hollow one. And so she's gotten some detail on her eyes, on the face, done a little more detail on that. And so now that I have these ears and they're pretty strong, I can start to even take like a loop tool and even them out. So they've got some lumpy places still where I pinched those slabs, and the edges are still kind of fat. So I'm going to leave the thickness of the ears so they're strong enough to hold themselves up, and I'm going to make the edges look thin. And it's that kind of illusion with clay that allows it to still have structural integrity and look very delicate. So you can start to just make the edges of things look very thin and delicate. I'm going to take away a lot of my fingerprints and pressing and pinching. And this loop tool in combination with a tool like this, a little wood tool, I can compress those ears as well. So at first those slabs were just pinched, they're kind of loose. This is all tightening them and making them stronger. And I'm doing it while the bamboo skewers can hold them up for me, because I'm pressing on them quite a bit. And if I hadn't let them stiffen a bit from when they were first soft slabs, this would be much harder. But they're stiffening, the bamboo skewers are stuck in places, and I notice I use these little balls of clay to keep these from popping out and the ear falling. I found something that was tall enough to help me reach this one. I just find whatever's around. I'll use a brick, something that I can put a lump of clay on to hold this up, even though it's way out here. If I have to stab it into the rabbit's body or into its head, I will, and I'll fix that later.
I think we're done.
You guys done?
Yep.
Did you get what you needed?
Yep.
Oh,
We're
good.
shape. We're in shape.
Excellent.
We'll set up time for we do some.
Yeah, that sounds great.
We at least a 2-week notice, so we'll try
Okay.
to work that out. So,
Sure.
we get a grab our mic.
Yeah.
And where's a good Tarrant County College sign? Put it all over, but we'd like to.
There is one, if you go out this parking lot to the left to Harwood, there's one off of Harwood at the
Like
campus
a brown
entrance.
type sign.
Yeah, it's the campus sign right in the front of the driveway. Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys are awesome. Thanks so much. I hope got enough different
What's the
stages.
large, is this simply just a whole